Hello, welcome to Hidden History and Odyssey Through Time. I'm your host, John Rodriguez, and welcome to Season 3 of the best history podcast in New York State. And welcome to our first episode of 2024. We here at Hidden History hope you all had a wonderful and safe new year. Now it's time to get down to business. This is episode 28 of the podcast, and the title of this episode is From the Racetrack to the Sky, The Life of World War I Flying Ace Eddie Rickenbacker. When World War I began in 1914, the use of airplanes in aerial warfare was still a relatively new concept. At the time, the U.S. Air Force did not yet exist, and so aviation in the U.S. military was a function of the United States Army Air Service. Established as an independent but temporary branch of the U.S. War Department during World War I, and replacing the aviation section of the Signal Corps as the nation's Air Force, the U.S. Army Air Service was a forerunner of the United States Air Force. There were people in the Army and outside the military who could not see any use for aircraft in warfare, while others felt that airplanes should be given specific combat roles. The United States would get a chance to find out how well airplanes worked in warfare when it entered World War I in April 1917. Plans were made, including fighting and bombing airplanes, as well as observation planes and balloons. Due to the fact that the Allied powers, Britain, France, Italy, had been at war since 1914, they were much farther advanced in military aviation than the United States. Still, they were allies and as such, provided valuable information to the U.S. to help build up its aviation sector. This information included not only technical data on new developments in the aviation field and other aeronautical equipment, but also information on how to use aviation proficiently in battle. The first U.S. aviation squadron entered combat in February 1918, manned mostly by pilots who had previously volunteered with the French. American trained squadrons soon joined the fighting, and the rest is U.S. Army Air Service history. Most American aviators flew French planes, since the United States was still ramping up aircraft production, and training could be deadly. In addition, brand new U.S. pilots faced experienced German enemies, resulting in heavy early losses. Despite these challenges, American pilots steadily improved, and one pilot, a former race car driver, would go on to become the most successful and most decorated United States flying ace, with 26 confirmations over the enemy during World War I. His name was Edward V. Rickenbacker, Eddie for short, and if you're interested in learning more about his life, stick around. Edward Rickenbacker's story, hidden history that has remained long forgotten, is the story of a true American hero intent on preserving the American way of life for future generations, and his extraordinary journey from race car driver to America's World War I flying ace. Edward Vernon Eddie Rickenbacker was born Edward Rickenbacker in Columbus, Ohio on October 8, 1890 to William and Elizabeth Rickenbacker, German-speaking Swiss immigrants. Later in life, Eddie changed the spelling of his last name to Rickenbacker, adding a K-E-R at the end of his last name and dropping the C-H-E-R, and he adopted a middle name, Vernon. The third of 8 children, 7 of whom lived to adulthood, Eddie worked at odd jobs since he was 7 years old, earning cash for his own projects. Life changed when Eddie's father was killed at a construction site in 1904, forcing Eddie to quit school immediately and start working any job he could find in order to support his family. Eddie lied about his age to circumvent the child labor laws and got a night job as a helper at the Federal Glass Factory. In a few weeks, he quit to take a job at the Buckeye Steel Casting Company. From there, he worked in a beer factory, a bowling alley, a cemetery monument yard, and with the Pennsylvania Railroad as an apprentice. He was unhappy and viewed every job only as a way to make money for his family. It was through these jobs that he landed in the growing automobile industry. This, combined with his interest in technology and speed, led him to seek out a career in automobile racing. Rickenbacker began working with cars in Evans' garage. He took a mechanical engineering course from the International Correspondence School in 1905 in order to become more proficient at working on cars. Later that year, he became employed with the Oscar Lear Automobile Company in Columbus, where he worked under Lee Freyer until 1907. He then followed Lee Freyer to work at the Columbus Buggy Company in Columbus, Ohio. It was there he started his racing career. In 1909, while in Texas helping the Columbus Buggy Company establish dealerships, Eddie offered to drive politician William Jennings Bryan on a Texas speaking tour as an advertising stunt. In 1910, working as the Columbus Buggy Company's branch sales manager in the Midwest, Eddie entered his first race as an advertising gimmick for the Firestone Columbus. He raced a stripped-down Firestone Columbus on a dirt track in Red Oak, Iowa, and had to exit the race after an accident. In 1911, Eddie had the opportunity to participate in the first Indianapolis 500. Eddie kept racing for the Columbus Buggy Company until 1912, when he left to pursue a professional racing career. He raced for a second-rate team called the Flying Squadron until the end of 1912, when he took a job racing for the Mason Company. Eddie remained with the company until the end of 1914, and after a brief time racing for Peugeot and Maxwell, he went on to become the manager for the Presto Light racing team, which lasted until the end of 1916. Eddie enlisted in the U.S. Army on May 25, 1917, when Major Louis Burgess, who was a racing fan, asked him if he would like to go with General John J. Pershing as one of his chauffeurs to France. Eddie would never race again, but that same thrill he got from racing cars would be replaced with a thrill for flying planes. While Eddie was living his life in the United States as a race car driver, across the Atlantic Ocean there was a world war being fought. In July 1914, the First World War, also known as the Great War, began after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria a month before. His murder catapulted into a war across Europe that lasted until November 1918. During the 4-year conflict, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, the Central Powers, fought against Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Romania, Canada, and Japan, the Allied powers. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on the German Empire, nearly 3 years after World War I started. Over the next year and a half, millions of Americans served overseas and supported the nation's war effort at home. Their contributions helped win the war and shaped both America and the world for generations to come. By the time the U.S. got involved in World War I, the population of whole nations had dedicated themselves to winning the war. Thanks to new military technologies and the horrors of trench warfare, the First World War saw unprecedented levels of carnage and destruction. By the time the war was over and the Allied powers had won, close to 20 million people, soldiers and civilians alike, were dead. Arriving in France on June 26, 1917, as part of the American Expeditionary Forces, 26-year-old Rickenbacker's first assignment was as a driver for General John J. Pershing at the rank of Sergeant First Class. However, his goal was to fly. With the help of higher-ranked officials, such as Major Billy Mitchell, Rickenbacker was able to get into flight school and in March 1918 was transferred to the United States Army Air Service, even though he was 2 years over the age limit. He trained at the 2nd Aviation Instruction Center in Tours, France, and when his training was complete, Rickenbacker was commissioned as a first lieutenant and became the chief engineer at the poorly prepared training base in Issoudun, France. After making many improvements at Issoudun, he was sent for training in aerial gunnery in January 1918. He qualified as a candidate for training to become a combat pilot, although because of an old injury to his cornea, he would never have better than average aim. In February 1918, Rickenbacker was assigned to the 94th Aero Pursuit Squadron, the first All-American air unit to see combat in World War I. And despite his old injury, Rickenbacker's aim wasn't too bad. He had his first confirmed victory on April 29, 1918, when he shot down his first enemy aircraft. Rickenbacker later had the following to say about his first confirmed victory in his 1919 autobiography, Fighting the Flying Circus. At 150 yards, I pressed my triggers. The tracer bullets cut a streak of living fire into the rear of the enemy aircraft tail. Raising the nose of my airplane slightly, the fiery streak lifted itself like the stream of water pouring from a garden hose. Gradually, it settled into the pilot's seat. The swerving of the enemy's aircraft's course indicated that its rudder no longer was controlled by a directing foot. At 2,000 feet above the enemy's lines, I pulled up my headlong dive and watched the enemy machine continuing on its course. Curving slightly to the left, the enemy aircraft circled a little to the south, and the next minute crashed onto the ground just at the edge of the woods, a mile inside their own lines. I had brought down my first enemy airplane and had not been subjected to a single shot. On May 28, 1918, Rickenbacker shot down 5 German airplanes behind enemy lines. Another victory came 2 days later before Rickenbacker was sent to Paris in June on leave with a fever. While in Paris, news reached Rickenbacker that his confirmed victory on May 28 over the 5 German airplanes officially made him a flying ace. Furthermore, confirmations had been secured for my 5th victory, and several cablegrams from America were handed me, congratulating me on becoming the 2nd American ace. The news had reached the States before it had found me in Paris. Rickenbacker was healthy enough to fly by July 31st and was ready to take his place in fighting formations yet again. He was nervous at the time because the doctors had told him it was highly unlikely he would ever fly again due to the ear condition he had. Rickenbacker would soon learn that no ill resulted from flying and felt he had fooled the doctors and was as good as new. But Eddie's ear issues would return to cause him pain. On August 18, he was in so much pain he was unable to get out of bed. Surgeons in Paris would eventually operate on Eddie's ear and fix the problem. He claimed to never have pain again since then. It was during his stay in the hospital in Paris that it was first suggested to Eddie to write a book of his experiences in the air. He began working on his book then and there and decided to keep a more complete diary of his day's work. Rickenbacker was named commander of the 94th, the Hat in the Ring Squadron, on September 24, 1918. The following day, he shot down 2 more German airplanes, victories for which the U.S. government awarded him a belated Congressional Medal of Honor in November 1930. According to Rickenbacker, October 1918 was a month of glorious success for the 94th Aero Pursuit Squadron, resulting in 39 victories and only 5 losses. On October 30th, Rickenbacker scored his 25th and 26th confirmed victories, which were the last added to his score. The final victory, the 69th, for the 94th Aero Pursuit Squadron occurred on November 10th, 1918, and the First World War ended the next day, November 11th. Eddie Rickenbacker returned home in 1919 as America's Ace of Aces. By the end of World War I, Rickenbacker, the Ace of Aces, has shot down 22 airplanes and 4 balloons. He earned numerous awards for heroism during World War I, including the World War I Victory Medal with 6 battle clasps, the Distinguished Service Cross 7 times, the Congressional Medal of Honor, and the French Cross of War. After World War I, Rickenbacker published his memoirs of his experiences, which he titled Fighting the Flying Circus in 1919. He left the military and became involved once again in the automobile industry. From 1921 through 1927, Eddie was a partner in the Rickenbacker Motor Company. However, the company pursued technology too aggressively and was too advanced for their time. Their competition was able to manipulate consumer conservatism and eventually drive the Rickenbacker Motor Company into bankruptcy. Undaunted by financial failure, Eddie raised $700,000 in 1 month and purchased the Indianapolis Speedway in 1927. The Speedway was host to the most famous of all American automobile races, the Indy 500. Having raced in the first Indy 500 in 1911, Eddie knew the importance of the race as a testing ground for automotive technology. On a personal note, after Eddie returned from World War I as America's hero, he was linked romantically by the press with a variety of women. However, given the grueling travel schedule he kept, he didn't have time for romance. That changed in 1921 when Eddie renewed his acquaintance with Adelaide Frost Durant, whom he had known from his racing days. Beautiful and wealthy, Adelaide was married at the time but was very unhappy with her husband. Once her divorce was finalized in July 1922, she and Eddie were inseparable, and on September 16, 1922, Eddie V. Rickenbacker married Adelaide Frost Durant in Greenwich, Connecticut. Eddie announced the marriage to his mother that evening via telegram, and he and Adelaide honeymooned in Europe. In the diary that Eddie kept during their honeymoon, he writes, "Like a child with his first real toy I am, only the most beautiful toy, not in the true sense of the word, but in the form of a wonderful pal to share and suffer through life alike." When they returned home, Eddie and his new wife settled in Detroit, Michigan. Before the end of the decade, the Rickenbackers adopted two sons, David Edward in 1925 from an agency in New York City, and William Frost in 1928 through a well-known actress in California. The reason that Eddie and Adelaide did not have children of their own is because Adelaide had a hysterectomy while married to her first husband. Adelaide's first marriage was stained by physical abuse and extramarital affairs. After having a number of miscarriages, Adelaide decided to have a hysterectomy once she realized that she did not want to start a family with her first husband. Early in their relationship, Adelaide told Eddie about her hysterectomy and offered to release him from their engagement if he was troubled by her inability to bear children. Eddie did not care. He loved Adelaide and wanted to spend his life with her. They would go on to be married for 51 years. While we are on a personal note, it's also worth noting that on November 6, 1930, Eddie Rickenbacker was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Herbert Hoover in Washington, D.C., for his actions on September 25, 1918 in France. On that day in 1918, Eddie attacked 7 enemy planes and, disregarding the odds against him, managed to shoot down 2 of them. Now a married man with 2 young sons, Eddie had to focus on making money for his new family. He worked for General Motors for a time, from January 1928 to 1932, and eventually became Vice President and General Manager of Eastern Air Transport Division of North American Aviation in 1932. In 1931, the family moved to Bronxville, New York. New York City was Rickenbacker's favorite home base and remained the couple's primary residence for the rest of their lives, along with their second home in Key Biscayne. They also owned a ranch in Kirk County, Texas in the 1950s. Under Rickenbacker's skillful controls, Eastern Air turned the corner in 1935 and showed the first profit in years, and it was renamed Eastern Airlines. In 1938, a group raised $331 million and purchased Eastern Airlines, and Rickenbacker was elected president and general manager. His leadership, as well as his fame, helped to make Eastern Airlines one of the most successful commercial airlines in the mid-20th century. On February 26, 1941, Rickenbacker was a passenger on Eastern Airlines Flight 21 that crashed outside Atlanta, Georgia. The survivors were rescued after spending the night at the crash site. Rickenbacker barely survived being soaked in fuel and trapped in the wreckage, with the press mistakenly announcing his death. Rickenbacker's injuries included a fractured skull, a shattered left elbow with a crushed nerve, a paralyzed left hand, several broken ribs, a crushed hip socket, a pelvis broken in 2 places, a severed nerve in his left hip, a broken left knee, and his left eyeball was out of its socket. After 4 months in the hospital, followed by months of home care, Rickenbacker healed from his injuries and regained his full eyesight, although he would be left with a slight but permanent limp. Rickenbacker strongly opposed the United States' entry into World War II, which had began on September 1st, 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. But once the US committed itself to the war in December 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan, Eddie supported the war effort as best he could. At the time, he was still recovering from the airliner crash in February 1941. At the request of General H. Hap Arnold, Eddie toured U.S. Army Air Corps training bases throughout the Southeast during March and April of 1942 to bolster morale, impress pilots with the seriousness of their mission, and secretly examine the bases and training pilots received. In September 1942, the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, asked Rickenbacker to tour bases in England as a continuation of your tour of inspection and to seek out evidence of espionage. Eddie returned from England in October, and Stimson immediately sent him on a tour of the Pacific Theater. While on a mission in the South Pacific, Eddie and his crew overshot its tiny island landing strip, got lost, and ran out of fuel. The crew ditched the plane safely on the water, but the emergency food rations and water supply were left behind in the sinking plane. They thought that rescue would come quickly because of Eddie's fame, but they remained lost at sea for days and then weeks. On the home front, Eddie's wife Adelaide remained optimistic that Eddie would be rescued. When it appeared as though General Arnold was giving up on the search, she stormed into his office and practically tore the decorations off his jacket, demanding that the hunt continue. Miraculously, Eddie and 6 others managed to survive in the ocean on rubber rafts for 24 days before being found and rescued 400 miles from where their plane went down on Friday, November 13, 1942, by Navy pilots. One man, Sergeant Alex Kazmarchik, had died after 2 weeks at sea. Suffering from exposure, dehydration, and starvation, 52-year-old Eddie Rickenbacker rested a few days, then proceeded on his original mission, including inspections at facilities at Port Moresby, Guadalcanal, and Eupola. Although he was back to business, being stuck on a rubber raft in the middle of the ocean, not sure if you'll ever see your children again, can really change a man. For Eddie, his faith in God was renewed. From the time of the Pacific ordeal, my faith in God was an active, open part of my life. Eddie Rickenbacker reported to Secretary Stimson and General Arnold on December 19, 1942 in Washington, D.C., and then returned to New York the following day, where he was reunited with his family. That same day, December 20th, Eddie spoke to the nation over the radio on all major networks from his apartment in New York. He begged his listeners to give more and more effort to the war, because you can never approximate the sacrifices our men are making on the battlefront for you and me. On January 25, 1943, Rickenbacker submitted his full report on the South Pacific mission to Secretary Stimson, and 3 months later, he was summoned back to Washington for a new mission. Hoping to further serve his country, Rickenbacker accepted a fact-finding mission to the Soviet Union, securing permission to visit the nation under the guise of providing the Soviets with technical assistance for their American aircraft. After making stops in India, Burma, and China, Rickenbacker arrived in Russia on July 19, 1943, and once there, he gained the favor of Soviet officials and obtained information on Soviet strategies and capabilities. By July 26, 1943, Rickenbacker had left the Soviet Union and was in Britain, visiting with the commanders and staffs of both American and British commands. He also visited several American units before meeting with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. After a pleasant lunch, Rickenbacker was asked about the Soviet Union and began to give his observation when, according to Rickenbacker, Churchill interrupted him in a bantering tone, as if to question the validity of his statements. In his 1967 autobiography, Rickenbacker claims that he then said to the Prime Minister, "Mr. Prime Minister, you invited me here and I was pleased to come. If you don't care to listen to what I have to report, then I would really prefer to leave, for I am behind schedule and have plenty to do, And if you aren't busy, you ought to be, as I would imagine you'd have plenty to do too. Winston Churchill then apologized to Rickenbacker and listened attentively as he spoke of his mission in the Soviet Union. On August 4th, Rickenbacker left Britain for Iceland and then Greenland, inspecting the US facilities along the way. He landed at LaGuardia Airport in New York City on August 7, 1943, and disclosed the information he had obtained in Russia to American officials. Rickenbacker's information resulted in some diplomatic and military action. However, the president did not meet with him. Rickenbacker would receive the Civilian Medal for Merit for his services during World War II. Immediately following World War II, Eddie purchased new Lockheed Constellation airliners, and Eastern was the first airline to fly them in May 1947. The payoff to Eastern was that it was the most profitable airline in the country in the post-war era. Eddie resigned as president of Eastern Airlines in 1953 to become chairman of the board. He named his longtime subordinate, Thomas Armstrong, president. Armstrong acted as a figurehead while all the important decisions were still made by Eddie. Eddie hoped to eventually name his son William as president of Eastern, but William had no interest in joining the company. By the late 1950s, Eddie's ideas began to age. Eastern had to struggle to keep up with his competition. Eddie became less flexible as time went on, and a series of bad business decisions started Eastern on a financial slide. Upper management forced Eddie out as Eastern's chief executive officer on October 1st, 1959. As his duties at Eastern Airlines diminished after 1959, he devoted more time to speaking for conservative causes and, by his own account, opened a new chapter in my public address experience with his hour-long speech to the Chicago Economic Club in April 1961. Eddie remained as chairman of the board until December 31st, 1963, when he officially retired from Eastern. In the 1960s, Rickenbacker became a well-known speaker. He shared his vision for the future of technology and commerce, exhorting Americans to respect the Soviet Union during the Cold War, but still uphold American values. In 1967, Rickenbacker published his autobiography, titled Rickenbacker, and gave a special edition to the employees of Eastern Airlines. He dedicated this book to his mother. With love and appreciation, her inspiration through life never failed me, and to his wife, whose constant confidence, love, and dedication have always supported me through failure and success. In 1970, Eddie's son William released a book, From Father to Son, the letters of Captain Eddie Rickenbacker to his son William, From Boyhood to Manhood. The book includes correspondence between Eddie and William from around 1936 until just before Eddie's death in 1973, and demonstrates a strong bond of affection that existed between father and son. Correspondence and testimony from Eddie's older son David are rare, but we can conclude from available evidence that a similar relationship existed between him and his famous father. Though loving, Eddie held his sons to high standards of conduct. He required that they live up to his ideas of hard work and honor as well. Being the son of America's ace of aces would never be an easy role, especially during the early days when Eddie and Adelaide were away and nannies were raising the two boys. However, both William and David were loved, and that's what counts. In October 1972, Eddie suffered a stroke that left him in a coma. Although he had left a living will, Adelaide refused to allow him to die and worked with Eddie and his doctors to aid his recovery. A few months after Eddie's stroke, he accompanied Adelaide to Switzerland to have her failing vision treated. Unfortunately, Captain Edward Eddie Rickenbacker suffered a fatal heart attack and died in Zurich, Switzerland on July 23, 1973, at the age of 82, and Adelaide did not regain her sight. Rickenbacker's body was cremated and returned to the United States, and memorial services were held on July 27, 1973. Rickenbacker's ashes were then buried in Green Lawn Cemetery in Columbus, Ohio. Adelaide was not present for the service because of her health, but Rickenbacker's two sons, David of Upper Montclair, New Jersey, and William of Briarcliff Manor, New York, were in attendance. On February 2, 1977, Adelaide Rickenbacker shot herself to death with a .32 caliber pistol at her home in Key Biscayne, Florida. At the time, she was blind, in failing health, and still grieving severely from the loss of her husband. Adelaide was 92 years old at the time of her death, and she was buried with Eddie in Green Lawn Cemetery in Columbus, Ohio. We would like to end this episode with a few words by Eddie Rickenbacker himself, words that can be found on the last page of his 1967 autobiography. We here at Hidden History feel these words ring true now more than ever. I want nothing further in material value or personal prestige. No power, no wealth, no political plums. But I do pray that this exhortation in the name of freedom and liberty will spread into every nook and cranny of this land of ours for the benefit of future generations. Let us therefore pray every night for the strength and guidance to inspire in others the gratitude, the love, the dedication that we owe our beloved country for the sake of our posterity. Thank God I have given my best to the land that has given so much to me. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you've learned something new today. Season 3 of Hidden History will explore the lives of veterans of the United States as well as veterans of foreign countries historically connected to our nation, such as Britain, France, and Spain. Many of their stories have been hidden in the pages of history and deserve to be told. Pictures, newspaper clippings, and links to external articles relating to a particular episode are available on our website, hiddenhistorypod.com. Thanks again for listening. I'm John Rodriguez, and until we meet again, this has been Hidden History and Odyssey Through Time.